He was born with nothing but a name that didn't fit: Ralph Lifshitz, the son of poor Jewish immigrants in the Bronx. Yet one day the world would know him as Ralph Lauren, the man who defined elegance for an entire nation. He grew up surrounded by concrete, not castles, but inside his mind, he saw a different world. Velvet jackets, mahogany libraries, polo fields, the scent of leather and freedom. A world where dignity wasn't inherited, it was tailored. He never studied fashion. He didn't belong to high society. But he understood something most designers never did, that clothes could be more than fabric. They could be identity. They could be escape. As a boy, he would press his face against the glass windows of Manhattan stores, staring at suits he couldn't afford. Not out of envy, out of imagination. In that reflection, he saw not a customer, but a creator. He once said, "I don't design clothes, I design dreams." And that dream began with a contradiction. A working-class kid dressing the world's elite. A Bronx accent selling the fantasy of refinement. An outsider defining what American would look like. He built not just a brand, but a mirror showing people not who they were, but who they longed to be. Because elegance for Ralph Lauren was never about money or birthright. It was about belief, the belief that beauty could come from anywhere, even the Bronx. He didn't follow luxury, he reinvented it. And from that paradox between grit and grace, reality and romance, a new vision of America was born. Long before the polo horses, the cashmere, and the golden glow of Fifth Avenue, there was a small apartment in the Bronx, crowded, noisy, and full of dreams too large for its walls. Ralph Lauren was born in 1939, the youngest of Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants from Belarus. His father was a painter, not the kind who hung art in galleries, but the kind who painted walls to keep food on the table. His mother, Frida, raised 4 children with warmth that no poverty could erase. They had little, but they had pride, and pride in that part of New York was a kind of currency. Ralph's name wasn't always Lauren. It was Lifshitz, a name that carried the weight of old jokes and foreign roots. Kids mocked it, teachers stumbled over it, but Ralph wore it like armor. When he was 16, he changed it not to erase his past, but to shape his future. Lauren wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about becoming who he already dreamed of being. In those years, the Bronx was a study in contrast, grit, outside glamour on the movie screens. Ralph fell in love with the idea of beauty not as luxury, but as liberation. He watched Cary Grant glide across the screen immaculate in a tuxedo and thought, why not me? He wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing a feeling, a kind of elegance that could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. At school, he wasn't the best student. He was the best dresser. While his classmates wore hand-me-downs, Ralph saved coins to buy ties, the one accessory that made him feel closer to the life he imagined. He didn't know it yet, but those pieces of fabric would one day change his life. After high school, he worked odd jobs. Salesman, stockboy, clerk. He studied business briefly but left before graduation. College couldn't teach him what he already understood: that style is not about status, it's about storytelling. In his early 20s, he took a job at Brooks Brothers, the temple of American menswear. There, among suits and silk, he learned the language of aspiration. Customers didn't come for clothes. They came for transformation. Ralph watched, listened, absorbed. And quietly, he began to imagine something beyond the traditional gray suits of corporate America. Something freer, more romantic, yet deeply American. He married Ricki Ann Lobier, a young woman from a world far from the Bronx. Their marriage was more than love. It was a bridge between where he came from and where he was going. Ricki understood his dreams, his restlessness, his obsession with beauty. She became his muse, his mirror, his home. Even then, Ralph had no sketches, no studios, no investors. What he had was conviction that style was not born in Paris or Milan, but in the human desire to belong somewhere better. He believed clothes could tell that story. Every night, he dreamed of building not a fashion line, but a world one stitched from freedom, optimism, and imagination. He once said, "I never saw myself as a designer. I saw myself as someone who wanted to express a dream." And that dream, born in a Bronx bedroom, raised on movie screens and window displays, was about to find its fabric. Because for Ralph Lauren, poverty didn't limit imagination. It made it sacred. In the late 1960s, New York pulsed with revolution, rock music, street protests, and the birth of modern fashion. Designers were chasing the future miniskirt psychedelia rebellion in color. But Ralph Lauren looked the other way. He wasn't interested in tomorrow's chaos. He was obsessed with yesterday's grace. At 28, he worked as a salesman for a small tie manufacturer. His job was to sell what others designed. But one morning, standing before a wall of skinny, lifeless ties, he felt something snap. They were cold, dull, obedient. He wanted something with heart. Wide, expressive, confident. He wanted a tie that made a man feel like a hero in his own story. When he brought his idea to his boss, a line of wide, bold, luxurious ties, he was told it'll never sell. Ralph smiled, quit, and decided to prove him wrong. With no funding, no office, and no fashion degree, he began designing his first collection of handmade ties under a new name, Polo, by Ralph Lauren. He sold them himself, walking store to store through Manhattan with boxes in his arms. Most buyers said no. Some laughed. But he kept knocking. He believed in something invisible, a style not bound by trends but by feeling. He convinced a small shop to carry his line. Within weeks, they sold out. The color, the texture, the attitude. It was unlike anything else. Word spread fast. Then came the moment that would change everything. Bloomingdale's, the temple of American retail, called him in. At first, they wanted his ties, but under their label. Ralph refused. He said quietly, "If my name's not on it, it's not mine." They threw him out. 6 months later, Bloomingdale's called again. This time, they gave him his own display, the first time in the store's history a designer had his own brand. Within days, the ties sold out again. From that one act of defiance, a philosophy was born. He wasn't just selling clothing. He was selling self-belief, the idea that class wasn't inherited, it was created. His designs weren't for the elite. They were for anyone who believed they could be. Soon, Ralph expanded his line beyond ties to shirts, suits, and sportswear that carried the same DNA: elegant, timeless, aspirational. The Polo logo, a man on horseback, became more than a symbol. It was a flag for a new kind of America, one where anyone could ride into the world with confidence. He once said, "Style is very personal. It has nothing to do with fashion." That statement wasn't arrogance. It was rebellion against trends, against class, against the idea that beauty belonged only to those born into it. Ralph Lauren didn't follow the industry. He redefined it from the bottom shelf to the boardroom, from the Bronx to Madison Avenue. Each stitch, each thread, each design carried the same message he had learned as a boy. You don't need permission to dream. You just need the courage to wear it. And with that courage, Ralph Lauren, the kid who once sold ties door to door, began stitching together a new kind of empire. An empire not made of fabric but of faith. By the early 1970s, Ralph Lauren was no longer selling ties from a suitcase. He was building a universe. His brand Polo had grown beyond accessories. It was becoming a language, a visual vocabulary of aspiration, elegance, and nostalgia. While other designers chased the future, Ralph looked backward to the timeless charm of heritage, the romance of open fields, and the quiet strength of confidence. He didn't want to dress people for today. He wanted to dress them for who they dreamed of being. His first full menswear collection appeared in 1968, blending rugged Americana with aristocratic polished tweed jackets, leather boots, and collars that stood as proudly as the men who wore them. Then came a bold move: women's fashion. In 1972, Ralph launched the Polo shirt, a simple piece of cotton that would change global fashion forever. Clean, versatile, unpretentious, it carried his now iconic logo, the Polo Player in Motion. It wasn't just a garment, it was a declaration. He said polo is not about clothing, it's about a way of life. The timing was perfect. America was in the middle of rediscovering itself, weary from war-craving identity. Ralph Lauren offered that identity stitched in navy white and khaki. His vision wasn't about wealth. It was about belonging. You didn't have to be born into privilege to wear it. You just had to believe in the idea of grace. His stores reflected that same vision. When the first Ralph Lauren boutique opened in Bloomingdale's, it felt less like a shop and more like a film set. Wooden walls hunting prints, jazz playing softly in the background. Everything whispered a kind of American nobility that didn't really exist yet. Everyone wished it did. It was retail as storytelling. Every jacket, every tie, every bottle of cologne was a passport to another life. He was designing not from sketches, but from memories, the movies he'd loved, The stories he'd imagined, the life he'd always wanted to live. "I create worlds," he said once. "That's what fashion should do. It should transport you." By the mid-1970s, Ralph Lauren had become more than a name. He was an architect of dreams. His aesthetic captured both sides of America, the cowboy and the gentleman, the rebel and the romantic. His brand became the uniform of confidence worn by presidents and artists alike, yet never losing touch with its Bronx heartbeat. When Hollywood came calling, Ralph didn't design costumes. He designed mythology. In The Great Gatsby, his suits brought Jay Gatsby's tragedy to life, immaculate, idealistic, doomed. For Ralph, it was full circle. He wasn't just making clothes. He was defining how the world would see America: graceful, ambitious, endlessly chasing perfection. By the end of the decade, Ralph Lauren was no longer a designer brand. It was a philosophy that anyone from anywhere could rise, rebuild, and redefine themselves. He had taken the American dream and cut it to fit. Not too loose, not too tight. Tailored perfectly to the imagination. Because Ralph Lauren didn't sell fashion. He sold the feeling of arriving even if you started with nothing. By the 1980s, Ralph Lauren had become more than a designer. He was a storyteller of the American spirit. His vision had left the stores and entered culture itself. From the red clay of the ranch to the marble corridors of Wall Street, his empire stretched across generations, bound not by fabric, but by feeling. He didn't just sell shirts or suits. He sold belonging, a dream of refinement wrapped in denim, a whisper of nobility stitched into every seam. His advertisements were not campaigns. They were cinematic portraits of a world people longed to enter. Families smiling by country estates, sun-drenched fields, polo ponies galloping through golden light. None of it was real, but it felt true. Ralph wasn't capturing America as it was. He was creating America as it wished to be. Ralph Lauren wrote, "One critic isn't a fashion label. It's a memory we all want to own." His company expanded like an unfolding story. After conquering menswear and womenswear, he launched Ralph Lauren Home, Ralph Lauren Fragrances, and Polo Sport, every product carrying the same emotional code of classic elegance and quiet confidence. He built flagship stores that felt like private mansions, not retail spaces, libraries with leather-bound books, mahogany desks, the scent of cedar and sophistication. Walking into one was like walking into a dream scripted by nostalgia. But beneath that beauty was discipline. Ralph ran his company like a craftsman, not a celebrity. He was involved in every detail, the weight of a button, the tone of a photo, the light falling across the display. To him, perfection wasn't a goal, it was an obligation. When Hollywood returned for Annie Hall and later The Great Gatsby and Miami Vice, Ralph's clothes didn't just dress characters, they defined them. His style became cinematic shorthand for aspiration, integrity, and understated confidence. By the 1990s, his empire spanned continents. His brand went public in 1997, turning him into a billionaire, but the title meant little. He still drove himself to work, still adjusted mannequins by hand, still believed that success meant maintaining control over the dream. He said, "Once people ask if I design clothes for the rich, I don't. I design for those who want to feel rich inside." That was his secret, his democracy of elegance. He turned aspiration into an open door, not a locked gate. He wasn't selling luxury, he was selling possibility. And in doing so, Ralph Lauren became something no other designer had achieved, a symbol of timeless America, confident, romantic, and endlessly reinvented. His clothes weren't trapped in decades. They carried the illusion of permanence. He became the tailor of a nation's imagination, stitching together the contradictions of identity and idealism. The boy from the Bronx had built an empire out of air and memory, an empire that made people believe in a version of themselves they'd only seen in dreams. He didn't just create a brand, he created a mirror where anyone, no matter where they came from, could see themselves reflected in the glow of possibility. Because Ralph Lauren didn't design fashion, he designed America. Every empire meets its test, not when the world is watching, but when the world moves on. For Ralph Lauren, that test came quietly, wrapped not in scandal, but in time. The turn of the millennium brought a new kind of fashion, fast, digital, disposable. The world he had built on craftsmanship and storytelling was being replaced by clicks, influencers, and speed. Style had become a hashtag. To some, Ralph Lauren was now a relic, a monument to a slower age, too elegant for a world obsessed with novelty. But Ralph never feared time. He had lived long enough to know that trends age faster than truth. He watched, listened, and adapted without ever betraying what made him different. When fast fashion conquered the malls, he refused to chase it. When luxury brands screamed louder, he spoke softer. His silence was his rebellion. He began to rebuild from within, reshaping his company not as a machine for clothes, but as a curator of experience. He closed stores that no longer reflected his vision, reclaimed control of licensing, and recentered the brand around craftsmanship, emotion, and story. Ralph Lauren was not dying, it was molting, shedding its excess to reveal its essence. He once said, "Fashion is not about what's new, it's about what's true." And so he returned to the truth, to the texture of denim, the smell of leather, the simplicity of linen. In summer, the brand became more intimate again. Smaller shows, rawer energy, a return to the dream that began in the Bronx, that elegance is not performance but presence. While others built digital empires, Ralph built sanctuaries. Ralph's Cafe in Paris and Ralph's Coffee in New York weren't mere restaurants. They were extensions of his world, places where customers could step into the story, not just wear it. The espresso came in cups with the Polo logo. The music whispered jazz. The lighting felt like memory. Everything told you, this is what time feels like when it slows down. He understood that his audience didn't need more choice, they needed more meaning. And meaning, like beauty, could only be crafted by hand. Even his runway shows evolved into cinematic moments, intimate, emotional, like scenes from an old American film. He invited fewer people, but told deeper stories. A man sitting in a wooden chair, a woman crossing a room filled with soft light. No spectacle, no shouting. Just stillness, the kind he had been chasing all his life. The critics who once called him outdated began calling him timeless again. Younger designers studied him. Consumers, weary of noise, rediscovered quiet luxury, a phrase Ralph had lived before it had a name. He didn't rebuild the brand by chasing relevance. He did it by defending its soul. When asked how he managed to endure through decades of change, he smiled and said, "Because I never followed fashion. I followed life." And in that belief lay his secret that true elegance doesn't compete with the future. It simply waits for it to catch up. Ralph Lauren had survived the century, not by reinventing himself, but by remembering who he was, the boy who once looked at a suit behind glass and decided that one day he would build a world where everyone could touch their dreams. In the twilight of his career, Ralph Lauren stands not just as a designer, but as a curator of memory, a man who turned an idea into an identity, who stitched together fragments of aspiration into the flag of an entire culture. He is no longer simply the founder of a brand. He is the architect of a feeling, that quiet confidence the world calls American elegance. He came from nothing, yet his name became shorthand for belonging. He never studied fashion yet. He taught the world how to dress. He never sold luxury. He sold the possibility of dignity, of self-respect, of hope, made tangible in cotton wool and leather. He once said, "I never saw myself as a designer. I saw myself as someone who wanted to create a world." And he did. A world where the working-class kid could dream of polo fields, where denim could be as noble as silk, where beauty wasn't inherited, it was chosen. Ralph Lauren took the American dream, abstract, imperfect, often broken, and gave it shape. He didn't invent the dream. He made it wearable. As decades passed, his creations aged like stories not bound to seasons, but to sentiment. The khaki trousers, the navy blazers, the crisp white shirts, each became symbols of a life people longed to live. His empire spanned continents, yet it always led back to the same idea that style is not about money, but about meaning. He turned his life into a parable of persistence, of restraint, of never losing sight of simplicity amid success. The world around him changed, trends rose and fell, empires boomed and vanished, but Ralph remained, still standing, still believing that elegance is not performance, but truth. His legacy cannot be measured in net worth or runways. It lives in something smaller, quieter, the way a person feels when they put on a Ralph Lauren shirt and for a moment carry themselves a little taller. That feeling of calm, of confidence, of self-made grace is his true inheritance to the world. He never spoke loudly. He never chased shock. His genius was not in invention, but in intention, the ability to make people feel like the best versions of themselves. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because Ralph Lauren's journey was never about fashion. It was about faith. Faith in hard work, in imagination, in the idea that beauty could redeem the ordinary. He built a legacy that outlived the trends, a dream that outlasted the decades. A man who began as a boy in the Bronx, staring through the glass of a store window, now stands on the other side. The dream maker, not the dreamer. He didn't just tailor fabric, he tailored identity. He didn't just sell clothes, he sold courage. The courage to believe in who you could become. And that is why Ralph Lauren will forever remain the quiet poet of the American dream, a man who proved that elegance at its purest is not what you wear, it's what you believe.